Reginald here. By popular demand, I'm going to do a tier list for all of the different weapons in Darktide. I'm going to be doing the melee weapons today, since this is actually a fairly significant undertaking to do for each set of weapons. There's quite a few. I will be doing this for each class, so we're going to start with Zealot and work our way through them all. I do have a couple of notes. This list specifically targets Havoc 40 players. I'm going to make another one for Orc Damnation sometime soon, I hope, but if I don't, just be advised that literally every weapon on this list that you see today is viable in Orc, and I'll at least try to mention where a weapon is like way below its Orc performance. Number 2, all of this assumes that you are at least a competent to very competent player. If you are struggling to beat Havoc 40 with the default meta builds, that doesn't qualify as you. And I'm not saying that to be mean, it's just that some weapons have a much higher skill floor than others, and you will think they are bad until you are capable of clearing that floor. And once you clear that floor, they're actually pretty good weapons. This is assuming that you at least meet the floor on all of these weapons, otherwise you're going to rate them a lot lower than I am rating them. Okay, let me explain the tiers real quick. It should be fairly simple and straightforward. Broken is for weapons that are literally breaking the game right now in several different ways, and I will explain each one as I go along. S tier has little to no downside and a lot of upsides. A has some downsides, but a lot of upsides. B has a lot of downsides, but some niche value and decent upsides. C is a niche pick or barely workable pick, and D is for don't. Alright, let's have at it. We'll begin here as a Zealot going through the melee weapons, since that's the class that's going to care most about them. Okay, so starting off with the Mark IV Chain Axe, I will be placing that in Havoc 40 for B. The reason for that is it's not a terrible weapon. It does have decent upsides. It can hit certain breakpoints that are still very impressive, even in Havoc 40. So there's niche value here. However, there's a lot of downsides. It's a difficult, somewhat dangerous to use weapon with somewhat uncomfortable times to kill on certain enemies, and you really have to commit to those attacks to get the kill. So if you're in a situation where there's a lot of enemies surrounding you and you need to serially commit to large commitment attacks, it just doesn't feel very good. Up next is the Mark 12 Chain Axe. I have a run where I did the Mark 12 Chain Axe. It was definitely the worst weapon I've tried using in Havoc 40, so D from me. The Eviscerators, or heavy chain swords as I appropriately call them, are actually okay weapons into Havoc, and they're a little underpowered than where I would like them to be, but they do have crit synergies, which works very well with different crit type builds, including chorus builds and FOTF spam builds. For this reason, I'm actually going to put them in A. They're still solid choices. They do suffer a little from lack of mobility, but both of them are good. Strictly speaking, if we're going to be as fair as possible, the Mark 15 is better than the Mark 3. However, the Mark 3 is still an acceptable weapon and is not bad enough to land itself in B. Next up, the Chain Swords. This is very specific to Zealot as well with these rankings, because on Zealot, both of these weapons are excellent weapons, but I'm going to actually put the Mark 13G in high A tier, right next to the Mark 15. It's an excellent crit synergy weapon with some good capacity to reach higher tiers of damage with the shred attacks, but it does suffer a little bit with its lack of good stagger into some targets, and that makes it a little bit less safe. The Mark II Chainsword, I believe it is now, has somewhat worse performance, and so I'm going to mark that as B instead of A. It's essentially the same weapon, but the real thing that takes it over the edge is that it's just a little slower than the Mark 13G for building crit synergy advantage, and that's really where the Mark A shines, is getting lots of crits over lots of hits. In Oryx, these are two weapons that rate very differently for me, and on Veteran, these also rate very differently for me, but we're talking about Havoc right now in particular. Let's talk about the shock Mauls for Havoc. Now, I've actually not had a chance to take these into Havoc, but I can have a pretty good guess as to what they're like, because they're not that great in Oryx already. Their breakpoints are a little stiff, you have to swing them a lot to do anything, and they're mostly just good safety and reliability sticks. For that reason, I'm going to say that they might have some niche value as support weapons, but that's about all they can confer. Next up, the Indignatus Crusher. This is an S tier weapon for Zealot. Yes, it's a little slow, and its breakpoints are definitely hindered by the larger health pools in Havoc. However, it is a fantastic stagger stick, which provides a ton of safety for the team, and with the right build, it still puts out immense amounts of damage and can apply Skull Crusher to a lot of different targets. That's pretty hard to compare to in terms of its team advantage, in terms of its team safety, in terms of the damage that you're capable of doing. It's just a really solid weapon. Okay, now I'm going to actually probably surprise you here. Initially, my assumption is the Thunderhammer would fall off really bad in a Havoc, but despite the fact that it has a lot of downsides and probably belongs in B, the niche value that it gets is so large that as a consequence, it actually belongs near the top of A. It's not quite S tier because the downsides are significant. You hit targets and stun yourself. You have to do all kinds of windup. You probably need to take a Martyrdom build to get the breakpoints that you need. But if you can get those breakpoints, you can do insane boss damage for your team. You can one-tap Crushers over and over and over again. You can knock Bulwarks open and then finish them off yourself. The value proposition here is very solid, and so I think that even though there are a lot of downsides to the Thunderhammers, and it does require you to hit a certain skill floor, if you can hit that skill floor, which I feel is very high, by the way, you get a ton of value. I think the same is true for the Iron Helm, but the breakpoints are harder to get, but going to be a fair bit lower into A tier than the Crucius, which is almost an S tier choice for me, but it just has too many downsides and lacks safety. Downsides, by the way, would be things like terrible dodges, really low dodge speed and distance, the self-stun mechanic, all of that stuff, right? Two more S tier choices for Zealot right away are the Relic Blades. I don't really care which one you want to pick. Technically speaking, the Mark 10 is the superior choice. However, they're both so good on Zealot in Havocs that it's really hard to choose. Yes, they're not as mobile as other weapons, and so some people will consider that a downside, but I consider that a skill floor. They're really still pretty decently mobile weapons. You can mitigate some of that by taking an offhand weapon like a bolt pistol or las pistol or something to make up for the sprint differentials here, but ultimately what they allow you to do is plant your feet in the same way you can with the Indignatus Crusher, deal tons of damage, and stagger lock large quantities of enemies with your melee weapon basically in perpetuity. It is an incredible weapon in Havocs, and it's really strong on especially aggressive Zealot players. Now I want to pause here in my typical order of operations and just talk about the Dueling Swords. All of the Dueling Swords are broken. Our competition here, in simple terms, doesn't include them. S tier would normally be where most people would place them, but that's wrong. They're simply outside the normal balance, especially the Mark IV, but even the other ones are so insanely good that they are treating Crushers like Poxwalkers for the most part. This weapon can basically one-tap anything, and it's pretty easy to consistently get it to do it. If you don't one-tap, you're often 2 or 3 tapping, and it's fast, safe, hyper-mobile, easy to sprint away from the enemy with, and basically the best possible choice of weaponry. It also has crit synergy, which is able to go into one of Zealot's strongest trees, which is the Blazing Piety tree. Other weapons usually don't synergize as well, especially the Crusher and the Relic Blades, and you're going to have to use other stuff. But with this, you get everything. So there's really no downsides to these weapons, and all upsides into all targets. The only thing it really suffers from is a little bit of lack of horde clear, and it's really not that bad at all. And it's easily made up for by any other weapon in Zealot's kit, like, I don't know, how about the Flamer? Okay, returning to our regularly scheduled programming. Another 2 additional S tier choices are going to be the knives. For almost all of the same reasons that the Dueling Swords are broken, these things are almost just as good, and the only reason they aren't currently considered broken is because they don't quite reach the highs on single target damage that the Dueling Sword can. The Dueling Sword can pop Crushers very easily. The knives require a little help. For that reason, the knives are just in S tier as excellent safety sticks that are also incredibly strong into most targets. I'd like to talk next about the Heavy Swords. Heavy Swords are excellent weapons. In Havoc, they're still excellent weapons. However, they're not the best possible weapons, and so we're going to need to place them in the right spot. I think that the main issue they struggle with in Havocs is a really bad armor penetration rate. So you should bring them along if you like them, especially if you're running FOTF instead of Chorus. And what that means is you're probably going to be looking at these weapons as B tier choices. Lots of upsides, but not necessarily the best choices. Now, most people take the Mark 10 and think that's the best one, and it is an excellent weapon, especially Horde Cleary. However, I think this is the better choice on Veteran in most cases. Generally speaking, I think that the Mark 6, I believe it's this one, is the superior choice for a Zealot, and that is because the uppercut blow with Death Blow is able to cleave so many heads on Maniacs and kill so many enemies at once that it is pretty wild to use. I have a video on a stream somewhere where I do like 6 kills in 1 hit or something, maybe it's 3 and I have to do 2 hits, but in any case, you can kill basically 3 Ragers at a time, maybe more depending on how they stack up, which is pretty wild. However, you still can't kill Crushers very efficiently, and so that makes these weapons B tier for me. Okay, up next in the don't category. I need to call these out specifically. The Tac Axes are not garbage weapons. In Oryx, they are excellent. However, in all of my experience, the breakpoints they hit are really bad in Havocs. They basically can't kill anything on first or second hit, and they take forever to chew through horrors or basic enemy mobs. And so although they have great crit synergies, they're really just, they end up being like sort of the auto pistol of the damage world. It's just too slow in Havoc to be worth taking. So these are actually probably A tier choices in Auric Maelstroms, but they are D tier choices for Havocs. Sorry. Now we're going to take the Rashad and place the Rashad in A tier. Actually, I'm sorry. I think we need to take the Rashad on Zealot and put it in S tier. This particular axe is one of the best weapons on Zealot and any class in the game, and people still don't realize how insane these things are. They are so good. They can stagger crushers very easily with the little swingy attack from the special, and they do a ton of damage and are basically just reliable damage dealers. However, they don't quite nail the breakpoints as easily for Brutal Momentum on Havoc 40 without some good damage buffs going. So they are weaker than you might like, but they are still incredibly strong weapons. In this sense, they have no downsides, hypermobility, and are excellent on Zealot. The other two axes are almost as good, but they are not S tier because they do not have the finesse stat, the attack speed bonus, and so on. So they'll land in A, but probably towards the bottom. To my knowledge, the Catachan Swords are not especially good in Havoc. They don't hit any interesting breakpoints, and they only have the funny parry, and that's about all they have going for them, which means that sadly, they're just not that good. Did I get everything? Looks like it. So there we have it. We have our Zealot weapon tier list for Havoc 40. If anybody disagrees with me on any of these assessments, go ahead, let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to chat with you about it and learn why. Maybe I've got a weapon wrong here. I don't know. But in my opinion, I've got it pretty close to right, so we'll move on to Psyker in the next video. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks so much for visiting. Warm regards.
Reginald.
I would like to take a moment to express my genuine and significant gratitude to Bonehead for becoming my first Oath Taker level member. Your support really does mean a lot to me and has made it so much easier for me to continue to justify the amount of effort I pour into this channel. I'd also like to thank Miles Williams Lewis and Joseph Davison for supporting my channel through my Adept level membership. Your atypical support really means a lot to me, and I appreciate it. I'd also like to extend a thank you to the rest of my members. Support helps the channel a lot. If you would like to become a member of this channel, there is a link in the description below and a join button next to the subscribe button. Thank you all so much for visiting. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.